Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. This podcast will have a little bit more domestic Australian content in it than the previous couple, probably to the merciful relief of most people, and that's because now that the government is settling in, we're kind of back to a sort of business as usual thing, and some local events are underway. First of all, I was very fortunate to have the chance to interview Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy. The first-term Labor government was a little bit standoffish as far as the media was concerned. Well, certainly the specialised media, the area that I work in, but this might be a sign that they're going to be a little bit more open and forthcoming. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now, I'm not going to scoop myself by running through the entire thing in advance. It'll appear in the next edition of APDR, the June edition. But in quite a short period of time, we only had half an hour. The minister's obviously a very busy person. We managed to cover quite a bit of territory, including things like the overall budgetary situation. And I'm going to continue to respectfully disagree with him about the true state of spending on Australian defence industry. We'll be coming back to that repeatedly. And we might also keep butting heads on the issue of secrecy, which has bothered me, the increasing amounts of secrecy surrounding defence projects. And we spoke, for example, about C-3000, the general-purpose frigates, and I'll come back to those in a moment, with the minister saying that companies are free to talk about anything that they want other than what's in their tender response. And he said that has been departmental policy forever. No, it hasn't been, unless I've been hallucinating. For the last 40 years, that is not the case. And I say that having worked for companies submitting tenders, as well as now a journalist analysing them. I've noticed that in the last few months, the department has been trying to do some sort of Jedi mind trick on this theme. Minister, this has always been the case. It's not true, and I'll have a bit more to say about that in the future. Now, since I've mentioned budgets, I'll also mention an event coming up that most of we defence observers are very interested in, and that is the annual budget analysis done by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I believe that is coming out on Thursday of this week. It's always worth reading. I've received an embargoed copy, but it's very, very strictly embargoed, and I cannot say anything at all other than repeating what I've just said. It is well worth reading. Now, another thing that happened in the last few days was the report into the Taipan crash, the fatal crash of 28th of July 2023, when a Taipan with the call sign Bushmaster 83 crashed into the sea off Lindeman Island, leading to the tragic death of the crew of 4. Now, the most likely explanation by far was a condition known as spatial disorientation, namely the pilots, particularly in these circumstances of very poor weather. It was at night, low altitude, a lot of things going on. It only took, the report estimates, about 20 seconds for the pilots to become sufficiently disoriented for the crash to occur. The report is online. Anybody who is interested, I suggest that you have a read. As you would expect, very thorough, very objective in the way that it goes about presenting evidence. But I have spoken repeatedly about the Taipan fleet in the past, and so I'll just repeat the succession of events that occurred after the tragedy of 28th of July. The entire Taipan fleet was grounded. It was apparent pretty quickly to most observers that the problem was not the helicopter, and that meant that the global Taipan fleet, otherwise known as the NH90 fleet, kept on flying, and even nearby New Zealand, which operates 8 virtually identical helicopters, they grounded their fleet for, I think, 2 or 3 days, but then they also resumed flying. But ours remained grounded. Then a decision was taken by Defence Minister Richard Marles around September 28th of 2023 that the fleet would never resume flying. And readers of APDR and listeners to early podcasts will know that what happened then was, I still think, one of the most disgraceful episodes in Australian defence decision-making. Requests from Ukraine for the helicopters was ignored. There's a lot more still to come out in that. They were dismantled, bits destroyed, some parts sold for spares, about $1 billion worth of helicopters torn apart for no good reason, except at the time there were plenty of people on the defence and army side of things who happily went along, or at the very least did not dispute the narrative that had developed in the media that somehow the Taipan helicopters are unsafe. They weren't. They were never unsafe. The global fleet has one of the best safety records of any class of helicopter at all. And probably that's because the underlying fundamentals were that the NH90s were designed from a flight safety point of view to civil standards, which are very, very strict, rather than military standards, which are not quite as demanding. I think for the logical reason that it's assumed, whether rightly or wrongly, that people who put on a uniform, that they're kind of aware that they're going into a potentially risky environment, whereas passengers boarding a commercial airliner are completely innocent, and so you just try that much harder with your commercial aircraft, including helicopters, to hold them to an even higher safety standard. So, quick summary, there's no reason at all for the grounding of the Taipan fleet in the first place. Okay, maybe 24 hours or something like that, then you've got a pretty good idea of what's happening. And no reason for the destruction of the 45 helicopters, and I'll repeat, it remains one of the single worst defence decisions I've seen, and I long for the day when there's some accountability for all of this. Now, I also mentioned C3000, both bidders under pressure, rightly or wrongly, not to talk about their bids, but ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems spoke with a few journalists. Previously, I've had, as listeners know, a good level of exposure to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and have a reasonable idea about the Megami frigate. Now it's been the turn of ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems to go into a little bit more detail about their bid, a MEKO 200 for people interested in the technical details, and they emphasised they regard their bid as being low risk. They've built a number of MEKO frigates. They've constructed them in numerous countries, including Australia, because the Anzac frigates that they are sort of replacing are MEKO frigates. They were all built, all 10, 8 for Australia, 2 for New Zealand, at Williamstown Naval Dockyard in Melbourne. The dockyard has now shut, but back then it was the centre of a lot of naval construction activity, and that they can, I think, advance the argument with a fair bit of credibility that they are a good, safe pair of hands. Now, they also mentioned that of the 2 options that they've offered, and this is where it gets kind of a little bit messy, they had to offer to be down-selected what is called the exemplar design, based on the ship that they are building right now, and that's a MEKO 200 for the Egyptian Navy. They were shortlisted based on that, but one of the conditions of the shortlisting was that they could offer a version of that ship if they chose to do so, which they did. So TKMS put in 2 offers, one on the Egyptian ship, the other, if you like, an Egyptian ship, but with a lot of Australianised systems on it, in particular the Saab 9LV combat management system, which is distributed across the entire RAN surface fleet. Now, Japan didn't offer an alternative to the Megami that they are producing for the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, accepting the Megami will need some modifications to fit in particular with Australian OHS requirements. I've mentioned that before. Now, there's still been, now that we're getting into sort of the almost the home straight for this evaluation, there's again been a lot of discussion about the importance of the strategic relationship with Japan and why the Japanese bid should be preferred for that reason. And I'll be very frank in saying, for me, it's hard to quantify what strategic relationship means. If we were to look at it purely in industrial terms, I'll say that Japanese industry is so large, so powerful, and so modern, it's hard to think of a reason why they should import a single nut or bolt from Australia. I recognise, however, if selecting the Megami leads to a higher level of cooperation between the RAN and the JMSDF, that could indeed be a very useful thing. Anyway, the senior TKMS person, Dr. Oliver Juckenhöfel, is in Australia briefing people, and he was kind enough to give up a bit of his time. And again, to preview this, I and some other journalists will be going to Germany as guests of TKMS in a little bit over a week. And in fact, if everything goes to schedule, I will be recording the next podcast probably from Bremen in North Germany. Now, you can't quite escape the international stuff, which I really like, and I'll just, again, try and canter through a few things from the sort of the national security perspective. And the latest tariff stupidity, I have to say, from US President Donald Trump is a threat to put 50% on everything from the EU on June the 1st. So we'll find out pretty quickly whether that's going to work. If it goes ahead, it will be yet another disaster, yet another setback for the US economy, even if this is reversed, which I expect it will. I mean, this seems to be some sort of on-off game that President Trump is playing, that he threatens countries, or threatens, in this case, a trading bloc with something, in the hope that somehow they're going to then rush around and find something to offer him as a sort of reward for removing the tariffs, so then he can claim credit for putting out the fire that he started in the first place. Now, I don't think that that's going to work. It doesn't seem to have worked with China, and it certainly doesn't work for companies, because there are so many companies that cannot make investment decisions based on this sort of on-again, off-again nonsense, hugely destabilizing. And I really do worry about the medium-term consequences for the US economy, what that's going to mean for Australia, nothing good, and what that's going to mean for the international security environment. Now, to make a bad situation worse, he's also threatened Apple with a 25% tariff on any iPhone not made in the US. At the moment, most of them are made in China. They can't really shift production to India for complex reasons. I can go into that if anyone's interested in a future occasion. The thing is, with an iPhone, they're marvelous devices, and it's not just a single Apple factory in China. There are about 1,000 sub-suppliers and subcontractors and things like that. So it's a sort of Apple phone ecosystem that's in China, and shifting that back to the United States is going to take years, if not longer. And it's simply just not going to happen. Now, the Australian government, and for that matter the opposition and much of the media, are simply pretending that this isn't happening, and that we will all wake up tomorrow and will somehow be back in early 2024 when everything was stable and predictable. Well, no, it's not. Speaking of going back in time, I'll also have to say that once upon a time, there were Australian governments that actually had a conscience when it came to doing the right thing in terms of international relations. Malcolm Fraser and then Bob Hawke made a contribution to the end of apartheid in South Africa. Some of my South African friends sometimes get a bit touchy about that and say, oh, well, Australia claims to have ended apartheid. No, I'm not claiming that at all. The bulk of that heavy lifting was done by the South Africans themselves, but Australia had a role to play at the edges. I also remember Bob Hawke's genuine outrage and distress at the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, when we don't know between, upwards of 5,000 students were killed, putting down the pro-democracy activists. And Bob Hawke made a spot decision that every Chinese student at that time currently studying in Australia could stay forever. The right thing to do morally, politically courageous. Now, I contrast that with our present government, and I've mentioned this before, which is still adopting a policy of pretending that nothing is going on and kind of why say anything unless it directly affects Australia. You might recall this was the answer I received when I asked why we weren't standing with Canada in the face of Trump's threats to turn it into the 51st state, and received, I thought, the extremely depressing answer, well, it's got nothing to do with us. To be clear, I'm not into megaphone diplomacy, and I prefer actually a very cautious, very stable approach to these sorts of things. But when a clear injustice is occurring, such as Israel's new and even more brutal assault on Gaza, trying to get Greenland from Denmark, that sort of stuff, I believe a few polite words from our government dissenting and pushing back on the situation are not only entirely appropriate, I believe that a lot of Australians would like to see a government behaving with a conscience. Now, a final thought on dealing with the Trump administration, and I've said that I don't believe in giving in to bullying and pressure, but there are plenty of people who do. There are plenty of people who think that Australia should be doing more to ingratiate ourselves with the Trump administration. Well, here's an idea. And remember who came up with this first. Maybe Prime Minister Anthony Albanese should offer to build Donald Trump a luxury yacht. Obviously, he's getting a luxury Air Force One from Qatar. And by the way, I have to apologise to the government of Qatar. It seems that he solicited the aircraft, so I guess that constitutes soliciting a bribe. But yeah, look at it. Maybe that's what we could do. The best of Australian industry offering him a mega yacht, using Australian timber for the furnishings, that sort of thing. Another quick rumour, AUSMIN, the annual Defence Ministers, Foreign Affairs Ministers meeting between Australia and the United States might not happen because apparently Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defence Secretary Peter Hegseth have a bit of a personal clash and probably don't want to be seen in the same room together. More to come next week. As always, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.